All right, cool. I am going to just really quickly talk about myself in JavaScript LA just for new people. We always get like a lot of new people on these calls. Just give like a brief summary and then we'll go ahead and hand it over to Emily for tonight's topic. Emily, just want to confirm with you as well. Do you have host controls? Do you feel like you're able to share your screen and you don't have any technical difficulties?
Yeah, it seems to be working perfectly.
Perfect. Okay. All right. Just give me a second here and I am going to share my screen. All right. So what we're looking at here is JavaScript LA's website, also called HackBuddy. And if anybody does not see this, let me know. Just raise your hand so I can course correct. But yeah, this is the meetup group that we've been having for several years now. Like I started this around 2011 or 2012, mainly as a way to just kind of help people learn JavaScript, including myself, right? Because I was actually, the real reason I started this group was because I didn't really know a lot of people in Los Angeles at the time when I was coding, who knew how to like do JavaScript code. It was more like back-end code. So I just kind of started a group. And then basically we've been growing it for years. We've had monthly meetups. That's kind of like our claim to fame. A lot of those meetups are on our YouTube channel now. And so you can find like specific videos from the past and you can see, all the videos we've had. We have a track here called Meetup Videos. In addition to that, we've come a long way from JavaScript. And so we're doing more software engineering. And I kind of talk about that in this intro video here. So if you want to just kind of get a sense of the channel and what we're all about, take a look at this video. One more thing that we're doing is we're also having open source and development and having people volunteer. And this is like a good thing where if you watch some of these meetups and you learn some of the techniques, you can immediately apply it to some of our open source. And this could help you like for your your own resume or your ability to level up. We pretty much use GitHub. And like we have community source projects that you can be a part of, as well as we're revamping our JavaScript LA website at the moment. And we're trying to rebuild it on things like React and Next.js and use things like unit testing. So I invite you all to come check it out. Again, software engineering focus. So we'll be looking at things like system design as well. And if you're interested in that, we have a study group that meets up pretty much Wednesdays and Fridays in the morning, 7 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, 7:30 a.m. I believe. So feel free to join that. We'll also be doing the data structures and algorithms soon. And so, yeah, a lot of fun stuff coming your way, right? So, all right, I'm going to hand over to Emily.
Hey guys. First of all, thanks for having me. It's a really nice opportunity. Thank you, Vijay, for kind of setting these up for a long time actually. So keeping it going too through COVID. Really appreciate that. I'm gonna figure out how to share my screen real quick to the right place to get started. All right, can everybody see what you think is a presentation? Great, awesome. Cool. So my name is Emily Thomas. I'm a product engineering manager at a company called Iterable. You kind of talk to you today about perfecting the confusion of testing. So it's going to be pretty high level. I'm not going to get into like the nuances of testing frameworks, but hopefully give you the tools that you need to come up with a testing plan for any projects that you work on, or maybe the company that you work at. Prior to being an engineering manager, I was pretty much just a front-end dev. So that's kind of where my niche is and where I really like to enjoy, and never really enjoyed the back end. So stayed far away from it as much as I could. I get started with just a little bit about me. From Chattanooga, Tennessee. So I don't know where everybody is located. I know that this is kind of set out of California, so I'm assuming you guys are in that time zone. But it's like 8:40 over here, so really nice place to visit if you haven't had the chance to come as well. And like I said before, I work at a company called Iterable. What they do is unified customer experiences that empower their clients to create and optimize the customer journey. So we do a lot of things like emails and notifications, like push notifications, text messages, anything that kind of has you interacting with your customer. They're a double unicorn and growing really fast. They're at 660 employees or something like that right now. But our code base is in React and Scala. So if you are interested in those two things, or you have any friends that are interested in those two things that are looking for their next thing, please let me know. We're always, really, really open to hiring. Or maybe we're the right thing for your marketing needs. So if that's the case too, reach out. All right, so I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story. This is me and my dad. Last year, I took my parents to a trip to Hilton Head in South Carolina, where I took my dad golfing for the first time. It was also my first time golfing. So we got this, I don't know what they call them, PGA something. They're very fancy people that teach you how to golf for a few hours. And there's a picture of me figuring out how to golf. I'm not even in the right attire. My form is really bad, and I was pretty stressed out. And I learned something in this afternoon of golfing, and that's golfing is hard. And I don't know how many of you have ever picked up a golf club before, but you might be wondering why golfing is hard. Golfing is hard because of the number of moving pieces. There's a lot going on. I like to think of myself as somebody who's pretty coordinated and pretty athletic, but this was a very new experience. And that's because of a few reasons. It is highly reliant on the ability of the person who's playing. If you don't know what you're doing, it's going to be really hard for you. The second thing is they hand you this bag of clubs when you've got like 13, 14 clubs in there and you have no idea which one to use. They're all kind of look a lot different. I see like faces, you're like wondering what in the world I'm talking about, but you'll see. And then you have this great thing called wind. You have weather, and whether you have great skill, and if you have the perfect club picked out, well, that ball's going to be taken by wind as soon as it's in the air. And then you have the course, right? Every golf course is different. Every hole is different. And it's got these traps for you laid out. And on top of that, on top of you have to maintain whatever skills you've acquired, whatever ideas and about which golf club to hit, what way the wind is going over 18 holes. So it takes you a long time, and you have to maintain that skill throughout it. So to wrap up, to play golf, the player has to aim the right club for the course with the right weather for their skill level for 18 holes. So what does that mean? Golf is confusing. And after this, I went home the next week and I was still thinking about this when I got back to my regular, day job of software engineering, and I realized something. Golf is strikingly similar to testing. You may be asking why. It's because a lot of it has to do with your skill and the ability level of how well you know how to create tests. And you have the engineering phases. You have the junior engineer, probably has no idea what they're doing. You have your senior engineers that's very pessimistic about anything that's not development, right? So on top of that, you have a bunch of clubs to use. You've got several types of testing out there, right? Your core end-to-end unit component integration. And then you have these other fancy words like browser accessibility, regression, acceptance, right? That's a ton of stuff to handle. You don't know exactly how to use it all. On top of that, you've got all these different frameworks out there that do a million different things. And it can be really hard to figure out which one you need to use when. And then you got wind. So what's your wind when you're doing test? What's kind of the direction of your company? Every one of our companies has a different product that they're offering that has different needs. And a lot of times they're strategic direction is constantly changing. They genuinely don't know what they're doing, which makes it hard as an engineer to prioritize what's most important to you when it comes to creating a stable product. And then you've got your course, which you've got these specialized product apps that have special needs. They do different things. Even if our company is doing one thing, we may host an array of apps from internal applications to booking flows to dashboards to marketing sites that all have different needs. And then we have used different languages for them. Even if we're in JS, we have different frameworks that we might be using as well. And then we all know about maintainability when it comes to test, right? This is just a small sample size, and I don't even know how accurate it is because it says that engineers spend 12% of their time testing. And I think that's like a very, very happy path. Most of the time it gets eaten up by everything else other than testing. And a lot of people work in places or work on projects that there's a zero test whatsoever. So if you want to implement tests, you're having to take time from something else. So we want to make sure that whatever we do write tests, that we have the ability to also maintain them over time and not just be commenting them out afterwards. So we come to the idea that testing is also confusing. So where do we start in debugging it? So similar to golf, the way that I took it was, let me figure out how to understand what my clubs and when to use them. So what are our clubs? Our clubs are our testing strategies and tools. So there's 4 main different types of clubs in golf. We start off with our woods. So what do you use your woods for? Those are your hard hitting killer long shots. If you ever watched or skim through a game of golf, when they hit that thing super hard and it goes like flying in the air, they're using a wood. So what's that? For our testing, those are our unit tests. These cover the most amount of bases. So what's a unit test? In a unit test, it's an isolated line of code is tested for the result. So the rule of thumb there is you test every function and if statement. So you got an example here. You have a statement, it's like if bubbles are greater than balloons, console log the bubbles are the best. That's essentially, you're testing that if bubbles are greater, then you're console logging that statement. You just want to make sure that for your logic, you're getting the intended output. Unit tests are often the most reliable, quick, and easy to maintain test. They take very little amount of time to run. And once you run them, you can kind of forget them because ideally, nothing should be breaking them. So in order to write a good test, you have to choose the right framework. So we saw a slide full of options, but I don't want to push a certain framework here because that's kind of not the point of it, but Jest is a really good option. But there's a ton of really good options if you're looking to get into unit test. So let's see, you've got Jasmine, Karma, Mocha, Jest, Ava, React and testing library. There's a million different options. It really doesn't matter which one you choose as long as you use it according to their docs. The best way to run these tests I found is to run them on every PR. Every time you have a developer trying to put code into the code base, you should run to see if they've broken some of your test. It's also really good to introduce them into your development cycle. So every time you add new lines of code, you should be testing those new lines of code. And if you don't have any unit tests at all, it's best to start with utilities and reusable functions, but really aim for the stars. If you want to code cover every line of code in your application, so be it. But it's really good to start small with anything that's used a lot. And it's kind of very important to make sure that you don't let them turn into component tests. So you don't want to be worried about the visual entities, but very focused on the logic of, is this doing the logic correctly and am I getting the intended output versus, is this button showing up in the right place on the page? Next, you have your irons and your hybrids. So these are kind of the worst, in my opinion. See, this is where I get a little opinionated in this talk. They're bouncy. They make the ball bouncy. They go 200 yards at most. So they're kind of like niche, and kind of you can use them a lot if you want, but they're not really great for people who are unexperienced in golf. And for me, these end up being your component test. So your component test verifies a single component in your application. So you test that it functions the way that you want it to. Component tests can get unwieldy fast, is the problem with them. So this is my personal advice coming next. Utilize unit test for usable components for your logic, and use visual component testing for your display. So what does that mean? You might be using something in order to control your component library, some type of personal component library that you have all your branding and stuff in. And if that really matters to you, you probably have something that you're using like Storybook to document all your different versions of your component. Storybook has great plugins that every time you create a new PR or merge something into your main, it'll show you what those components look like before and how they've changed. And this is a great way to kind of see if you're regressing in any of your designs, if your designs have intended consequences, and so forth. Yeah, again, regression test visual changes on every PR, verify their intended consequences. Next, you've got your wedges. So your wedges are very specialized. They can get you out of really bad situations very effectively. So when you're in that sand bunker, or when you're like in the middle of the woods and you're trying to get your ball out of that heavy grass, you want something that's accurate and can get you just a low distance. So essentially these, the wedges just kind of make your ball pop over and move to where you want it to go. So these are your integration tests. They can really get you out of some bad situations. An integration test verifies a contract between the front end, an API, or a third-party tool. And when I say third-party tool here, I mean it kind of very loosely. You could be integrating one component of yours to another component of yours to verify it works. And that's also a valid use case for an integration test. Integration tests can be mocked, or you can run them against the real service. And that completely depends on what that service is, what uptime you're expecting, and kind of like what relationship you want between those two things. These should 100% be part of your deployment process if you want them to be, but I would recommend being very careful on whether you require them to push code, because if you are testing a third-party service, you don't want to necessarily block your pipeline if they're down. So you want to be a little careful there. Again, you want to choose the right tools. And for these, it's much like before, Jest is a great option, as well as the many other options you'll find online for this. Kind of advice here is to use them sparingly. They're not really necessarily all about testing your code, but more testing that you're complying to what you've agreed on in these contracts with your either a partner or your API or another team's code. So its purpose is a little different. My advice would be to mock data as much as you can, so that if they're down, you can still run your test effectively, verify that you're doing the right thing. All right, now we've got my favorite. It's the putters. So what do the putters do? It's the last club that you should ever use, because it puts the ball in the hole. It's made for that last couple of feet to kind of sink, and you get that great moment afterwards. It's really hard to use, actually. So these are your end-to-end test. An end-to-end test is a runner spins up a browser instance, views the application, and then completes a series of steps. Their greatest value is to confirm critical functions work in production. What's critical functions? Well, that can be as simple as the page loads, there's content on the page, maybe there's a certain piece of text that you use to verify that, or it could be that an entire like user flow or path that's essential to your business is usable and functioning properly. There's two different ways that you can use these. The first is using them as a gate pass to release into production. So you've run a series of tests for integration, unit, component, whatever you want to. You've built your app, compiled it, and now you're ready to dump it into an S3 bucket or to host it. This is a great final step to confirm that it works the way that you want it to. and that if it fails, it halts the release to production. And you could use them as a synthetic test. So a synthetic test is run on a particular schedule that's up to you. You can run them every minute, every 15 minutes, every hour, once a day, once a week, whatever is needed, depending on your release cycle. And it verifies that the critical paths are up. And usually when these fail, it's going to be a fire alarm for your org. It should be kind of like an all hands on deck to fix the issue. It could mean multiple of things. It could mean that you released a bug. It could mean that a service is down, your API is down. Maybe a bad actor has brought your website down. It could mean a lot of things, but it usually means something bad happened. The problem with end-to-end test is they can be slow and brittle and hard to maintain. A lot of the times they fail unexpectedly because they couldn't find a certain selector on the page. If you've got more than one, you're usually looking into like 5, 10, 15 minutes to run these tests because it's asked if a user is actually going through your site. So out of everything, this is the place that it's probably most important to choose a reliable framework. You can kind of divvy the frameworks up into two sections. Here are your Selenium-based frameworks and your non-Selenium-based frameworks. And the main one is Java and one is Node-based. The main difference is one uses a web driver and the other goes directly to your browser. If you're looking for speed and for reliability, they're finding that the browser is better. So people are now starting to prefer non-Selenium-based frameworks. But kind of choice is up to you with that. If you are looking at some non-Selenium-based tests, the two that I haven't used Test Cafe yet in production. I have used Cypress. They run pretty quickly, and there's not a lot of brittleness to these two. So I would highly recommend using one of these. And then if you're running something like synthetics, you have to use some type of runner to trigger the test and give you a dashboard of the results. I've heard a ton of great stuff about Checkly. I've been wanting to try them really a lot. But they kind of offer that you can plug in any framework or any language that you want to run your test, and they run them in it. You can pick whatever locations and how long in between you want to run your test. You could also go the AWS route. If you were using AWS already, they have something they call synthetic canaries. So that's also a really good way to do it. They provide a little dashboard within AWS where if you're managing everything else in there, it's pretty simple to run those tests through there. And again, you just upload whatever language, whatever code you want, and it'll run the script. One thing here is that you should probably limit how many tests that you do run in your pipeline for releasing to production. Because once you get into that spot where you're waiting 5, 10, 15 minutes for your test to run, that's adding on to the time it takes you to get code into production. And if it is brittle, you have to rerun those tests. So you could be sitting there 30 minutes just waiting on something to say that you released it. What I've done personally in my production apps is the Cypress test essentially just checks to see if the page rendered. And if the page rendered, then we said that the build was successful and we're okay with releasing to production. And then we have synthetics that run the test afterwards. So run plenty of synthetics. You can essentially run as many of these as you want. There's not that much cost to it. They're pretty cheap to run on any something like Checkly or even AWS. You're just paying for that runtime, and it's not too bad. It's well worth it. And you want to develop with end-to-end test in mind. So when you're developing anything, you want to make sure that you're using selectors or class names or IDs that are going to make it easy for your end-to-end test runner to find them. Because the trickier you make it, you don't want to be doing like nested selectors and like, oh, just find the div tag, because it's going to make them a lot more brittle. So those are your types of tests. So I wanted to run through like a really quick scenario of what a possible developer might be faced with and a possible testing plan that they could come up with. So So you work for a company that has a consumer service and they have an online flow. It's integral to the business making money. They really care about their brand and experience. It's like something that's very high and mighty to them. They want to make sure that every customer is getting this really great customer experience. Unfortunately, they don't have enough platform resources, so your backend team is pretty strapped, pretty bad. And that means that you release more bugs than you would like to, and getting help is a little harder in this case. But you rarely have front-end bugs for whatever reason. The JS code base is a lot more stable. So what would a test plan targeted towards this kind of look like? Well, here's my suggestion for that. Focus your unit test only on the utility functions. Don't worry about total line coverage since you don't have that many bugs in your front end anyways. Focus on your end-to-end synthetic test on your booking flow. So make sure those critical paths are working. Because the great thing about end-to-end test in production is they catch front-end and back-end bugs. If your API is down, you're going to know because of those tests. It's like a good freebie. And then you've got the third thing you should focus on, integration API test on your pipeline. So this kind of just function as every time the front end releases code, you're going to test to see if the API is up and running according to the contract that the front end team has agreed to. It'd probably be non-blocking in this case, but just run for good measure. And then since you are brand conscious, a visual component test on whatever component library the team is using is probably going to be useful as well. So that's kind of like the level of order that I'd put for putting effort towards those things and resources. That's just one scenario. There's probably like a million different scenarios that you can come up with these would change drastically. So if you follow these, I hope you're on your way to becoming Scotty. If you don't know who this is, I had to look him up too because I don't really know golf that well. But he won the Masters this year and he was pretty junior. It's like his first time winning anything, I'm pretty sure. So you could be like him. Anyways, thanks. I'm happy to answer any questions if you have them to the best of my ability.
I had a question.
Sure.
Are there testing frameworks or methods that minimize how much testing stuff you have to actually put into your code, into your production code?
Like selectors and stuff, or how much you have to write?
Something that would be like a framework or something that would run over it. Let me frame it like this. Do I have to write little test statements inside my actual services and inside my actual front end? Or can I invoke something that surrounds it and reaches inside and tests what has to be tested?
Yeah, so most of the time, you're going to have a file that sits next to your source. That's just, you can name it testing, and that's going to have all your testing docs or your testing code. And so it's going to be not in with the rest of your code. And so when you compile your code, none of that testing code is going to be compiled with it. So it'll use different scripts to run. And it's not going to be in that production code that you ship for most, if not all, testing libraries that I've seen.
Okay. Other thing, if you could clarify what you mean by synthetics.
Yeah, so synthetics is essentially, it's kind of like a robot goes through your app. So it's like a fake customer. So that's why they call it synthetic. And so on whatever time that you have set up, they'll in the node environment, it's kind of like a robot sets up your website, and it plugs and plays whatever you tell it to. So it'll press all the buttons you want it to and go through as if it's a customer. So your site assumes it's a customer, but it's just this synthetic environment that's set up. And yeah, that's kind of it. Just kind of like a robot goes through your website for you.
Any other questions? Go ahead. I think you have.
Actually, if I could jump in with one more.
Sure.
Also, I was curious more about the selenium versus non-selenium distinction on testing.
Selenium versus non-selenium?
Yeah, in other words, I'm somewhat familiar with Selenium and using that to run the browser. I guess I'm not familiar with the other half of the equation.
Yeah, I can go through that a little bit when we get to it. So Selenium-based frameworks, they use a WebDriver. They're based on Java. They use a WebDriver to interact with the browsers. And then non-Selenium-based frameworks, they don't need that WebDriver because they're based in JS and they interact directly with the browser. So you don't really experience anything different as a person there's a little bit of a difference when you're developing. The syntax is a little bit easier with non-Selenium-based framework. It's going to be very close to the code that you write when you're coding in JS. But as far as running, you don't visually see any difference. Sometimes the builder or the runner can go faster with one or the other, depending on what you're doing. But it's more about like the kind of the coding feeling, or like the syntax that you're going to write is going to be different.
Okay, thank you.
Does anybody here do testing like we were kind of talking about earlier, like at the beginning of the slides? I think it was like, what was it, number 12%, 20%?
Yeah. They say, well, that one showed how much time a developer who does testing spends on testing, and that's about 12%. I think there's that site that publishes how many engineers use testing, and it's not that high.
Got it.
It's very easy for engineers to skip.
Yeah. Why do you think that is? Is it just because the frameworks seem complicated?
I think it's a maintainability problem. I think a lot of places, even the last place that I was at included, like when we were writing a new app, we had these like high ambitions of testing, and we wrote these tests, maybe not fully understanding what we were doing. And then when it got down to like, okay, the app has been released for a few months, maintaining those tests was just painful. So started commenting things out. So we're like, oh, we don't actually need to see if that works because we don't know how to fix the problem. And so like, I think maintainability is a big thing. And we did a whole refactor project actually on our test at one point. And we had an engineer that dedicated like a whole sprint. So it was like 2 weeks to just researching testing. And their job was to find out what exactly is going to work for us, and how do we implement that. And then they spent a month writing the test afterwards and switching over the test. And so it's like, it's a time thing. I think it's maintaining, and then it's finding the time when you're bogged down with like a million different product asks, especially if you're working at a startup. A lot of the times, like, it's kind of do or die on some of the features that you write. And so it's really hard to buy out that time. But it's up to like us as engineers to advocate for the time to do it.
Sure. Yeah, for sure. Are you also like advocating for testing like based on accessibility? Just curious.
Yeah, I think that's another great thing. End-to-end testing is a great way to put that in. I haven't had the need to get very deep into it, but as you know, cross-browser accessibility, those are all different things that if they're critical to your business, they should 100% be part of your testing plan.
Yeah, fair enough, for sure. Does anyone else have questions? Got a smaller audience today, but it's not too bad. I mean, we'll try to like ask like the most important questions and figure it out. I think Baldo has his hand raised. Go ahead.
Hi, Emily. I was curious, do you have any good resources that you would recommend for reading up on and trying to, as a junior engineer, I'm trying to read up in more on testing and educate myself. Would you have any you would recommend?
Let me see. I think off the top of my head, I don't have any. I can come back to you with some. there's a lot of information out there, which is like good and bad. Because there's like a lot of people who are either like pushing a framework that they wrote, or they're also in the same bucket of like not knowing what they're doing. So it's a little hard. What like Jay, or what are you coding in? I guess I would ask.
Right now, I've also been learning on JavaScript and Ruby and TypeScript. So I'm curious about what frameworks you would recommend reading up on.
Yeah, so if you're getting into React, they support two libraries themselves, which is Jest and React Testing Library. So a lot of times, depending on what framework you're working on, they're going to recommend a certain library that works best with them. That's a really great place to start. Yeah, that's kind of where I would start. And then there's some industry leaders in them, and just going through their docs, and they have a lot of like how to and comparing themselves to others is really good. One thing that's it doesn't seem important, because I think web developers have this like weird stress on performance, but testing performance is actually really important. And so you'll find a lot of articles comparing how long the same test takes in different frameworks. And that can be really beneficial to choosing the right one for whatever you're working on.
Thanks.
Seems like we have another question from Hector. I guess he said opinion on test-driven development. So maybe he means what's your opinion on that? Do you have a methodology for that?
Yeah, so I guess core like actual TDD, you're supposed to write your test and then write your components, right? That's great in theory. It's like really great in theory. There's like this practicality of it that doesn't exactly pan out. Okay, let me see what she said. Yes, that's what I meant. As learning, I hear a lot about it, but wanted an insider opinion. Well, I don't know how insider I am, but I certainly think that a thing like unit test should have a place in the actual testing lifecycle, or sorry, in the development lifecycle. So one thing that I advocate pretty heavily on my team is when you're scoping how long it's going to take you to do a ticket or a feature, you should be including how long it's going to take you to write the test for it. I don't really care whether you write the test first or the code first, but I think it's important that when you do add code that you are adding test. So I hope that kind of answers your question. It's a little vague, but I don't necessarily, I guess to summarize, not a fan of like heavy, you have to, do it this way, but I think you need to have test in whenever you add new features.
So like just to kind of help or summarize, right? You're kind of saying that testing is important, but like doing TDD like essentially might be like overkill in some ways, like just pure TDD because it's not realistic to the real world.
Yeah, I think in some cases, and it depends on developer style too. Like there's no one way to do things. So as long as you're shipping quality code, it doesn't matter in what order that you write it, at least in my opinion.
Got it. Okay. So what kind of testing framework are you using? Like, like lately, I guess. Are you using Jest and Cypress, Selenium? I think you kind of talked about some today on this call.
Yeah, so the last testing suite I had, part of it was non-optimal and part of it was exactly what I wanted it to be. So we were doing synthetic test in a Selenium environment using New Relic. You might have heard of New Relic. It's like widely used as a monitoring tool. So the company I was working for used that for like back-end, front-end, and everything. And they only had one choice. It was the Selenium-based tester. So that's kind of what we had to use. That was running synthetic test every hour. We had Cypress running end-to-end test on every push to production. So before we were released, there was some like core functionality we wanted to check, and that would run in Cypress, and that would go through AWS is where we had that living. So it was right before it pushed the S3 bucket, it would test in Cypress. And then we had Jest for unit test. But I've used like an array of different things. React testing library I've used in the past. And Nightwatch is kind of this, it's like an end-to-end tester and unit tester, which those can be a little cumbersome in that you kind of get confused in what you're doing. The tools are really good, but sometimes the separation helps engineers make sure that their unit tests are actual unit tests and their end-to-end tests are actual end-to-end tests. So yeah, that was the kind of testing suite that I used last.
Cool. I mean, like, I think like whenever I'm starting like a brand new repository or something, like I'm greenfielding new project, there's a lot of like thoughts in my head as to like how to make this project like more, more safe and well tested. Are you using like things like linters? Are you writing like any kind of like automation scripts like in Travis or GitHub hooks? Do you have like examples of that or anything like that you might be able to share if applicable?
Yeah, ESLint, big help using the Airbnb linter, and you choose whichever one you want, as long as it's consistent is the important thing.
Yeah.
Prettier has been also a really good tool in code quality. So they just come in and format your code. So especially if you got multiple people, open source projects working on the same thing, and you want some consistency, a great tool to use there. I had like a little, I think it was Husky. So like Husky with Prettier. And what that does is like, it does this, whenever you commit code, it'll lint it for you, and style it the way that's consistent. So those are a couple things that I've used that I like. Those are like automatic adds out to new repos.
Yeah, definitely. Does anybody else have questions here? I think we have one person coming in kind of late, but yeah, feel free to ask in the chat as well.
I'm interested to know how many of you guys use tests, like write test right now. It's okay to say no.
Yeah, I think if people have questions after the fact too, you can definitely like comment, on Discord or on YouTube if you see this video, and we can try to like share that with Emily here. Baldo says he's taking a course on Code Academy at the moment. What kind of course are you taking?
They're covering JavaScript testing with what's the name of the library? I can't remember right off the top of my head. But yeah, that's because when I went through boot camp, we didn't cover actually writing tests. Everything was written for us. And that was when we were doing with Ruby, it was with Capybara for the JavaScript portion. And we had just a simple script we would run every time we would be working through our labs and through the lessons. And that would check our code and say, these were deliverables, and said you failed on, line 7, you need to go fix this portion of it. But writing tests was something I didn't really do. So that's why I'm trying to get into it and get more enrichment.
I will say that there's only one language or so one framework that I say not to write tests in, and that's Enzyme. And it's the reason why is because it's not compatible with React anymore. And so if you're spending time writing in it, your tests are going to be a little useless next time React releases. Like if you're trying to use the most up-to-date JS, it's not going to work.
I did have one more question. Have you done anything with testing for accessibility?
I have not personally, but I do know that you're essentially using the same concepts of selectors and making sure that that content is available, is available. So it's not something that you necessarily have to pick a certain testing library for or do anything really differently. It's all about when you write your test, what you're really focusing on.
Do you know any resources or like, do you follow certain people? And it's okay to say who you follow, that, are good at like talking about, like learning testing and, like maybe like doing good best practices, as far as like, if you had to onboard somebody at your company, right? Like how would you help them like get up to speed on what it is you're trying to achieve in your testing?
Yep. So Kent C. Dodds, he's like a really good resource in all things JS. But he's actually wrote React testing library. And so he has a ton of really good, he's got some really good opinions and really good facts on how to write test. Yeah, I can type that into the chat. There you go.
Yeah, I got you. Kenzie Dodds. So I was gonna ask you, because I think you said earlier that you didn't want to mention like some people are writing their own testing framework and then advocating for that as opposed to like everything else that's already industry standard. So what did you mean by that? And did you mean Kent?
I think everyone does it a little bit, whoever writes their own, right? But didn't mean Kent directly at all. I actually met him last week or week before last. Really nice guy. So
oh, that's cool.
Nothing, no shade there. But I just meant it when you're looking for resources, there's a lot of stuff that's skewed. A lot of testing companies also, like what I call them companies, the frameworks write their own like docs that look like innocent blog articles comparing like their product with other products, and their product always wins. And so you have to be a little careful when you're looking for resources.
Gotcha. So you're saying avoid the ones that seem like more corporate or company like based or something like that probably don't have as much like usage, right? So all right. Yeah, cool. I actually feel like Kenzie Dodds is like pretty good resource too. We've been in touch with him and tried to see if he can show up for one of our meetups. Cross your fingers. Yeah, just I think so far this has been a great meetup. I guess like maybe just kind of like in closing, like I can ask some more questions, or like if anybody else wants to like add some questions in the chat, we can take them. You okay on time, Emily?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Just in general too, because like I feel like this is sort of interview season, so like people are asking me a ton of like questions, like to prepare for interviews. So if you are preparing for an interview, like let's say you want to get a job, 3 months from now or something like that, what kind of things should you be doing to show like a company that you have testing experience?
Yeah,
or 6 months out or 1 year out, whatever the time frame might be.
Yep. I just joined a new company, so I just went through the whole like testing. It's kind of like a test too, interviews. The whole interview process recently, and I've seen now more than ever that testing comes up in the job requirements and in the interview conversations, and so I think that it doesn't matter what you choose to learn. I wouldn't stress on choosing the framework that everybody else is using. Choose something, doesn't matter what it is, and get experience in the right ways and when to use certain tests. And that should be your kind of stress. It's how to properly implement the test versus the actual syntax, because all that stuff can always be Googled. Right? But you can't really Google the questions that are more situational based. Just kind of have to come after practice. So, I would maybe in your mind come up with a product or a project, and then try to determine what test would be needed to ensure that product is successful in production, and write test accordingly, and see what type of edge cases that you can get into, things that are more difficult. Try to get experience with something when the test runs too long, the test time, the time that it takes to run the test is too long. How do I figure out how to shorten that? Those concepts are going to be much more important than like the physical code that it takes to write the test.
Yeah, definitely. I can attest to that too. Like sometimes these testing frameworks, like you'll see like errors in the console, like memory leak, or like, something, like took like 30 minutes just to finish the entire test suite. So I guess like if you know like any optimization strategies, that'd be great. Or can point to that, that'd be great too.
It's very one-off. I say like just for a lot of tests, especially the component test or end-to-end test, figure out how to do selectors properly. That is like the way that you unlock those tests, because that takes them from being brittle and taking too long to like always working the way that you are intending and going fast. So if you guys don't know exactly what I mean by selector, it's essentially you have to tell the runner what element to pick on the screen, what element you're looking for. And you can do that in a ton of different ways. You can choose the HTML element that you're looking for. You can try to find certain text on the screen. Or you can provide a selector tag by class name ID, or some frameworks have like a little thing that you can drop in to your HTML as well to find it. And clicking on the correct thing is also important, right? Like if you have a button, you want to click on your button element and not the text on the button, like that can also lead to problems. So experimenting with that type of stuff, figuring out what's most efficient for the application that you're testing is going to be important.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. And also I was going to ask, in line with that question, do you feel like snapshots, what's your take on that? Like, do you feel like they're useful or useless? Because there's sometimes a debate on that.
Yeah, I used, I guess one thing that I forgot to mention is I had a library that used Storybook, and we took snapshots of the components in there on every PR. And it was useful in that way. It gets cumbersome a little bit sometimes because it's not always accurate. We had a problem where like it would detect that the files had always changed, because when you rebuild the files, the selector names are different, and so it would think that it was a new looking file. So there's just some nuances there that you have to iron out. But if you are working on a project that is very much based on the UI, and you have a ton of people or a ton of like moving parts in the UI, snapshots can be very helpful. It really depends on like how fast you're moving and what you're really stressing to test.
So you mentioned Kelsey Dodds, and you said that you're a fan of him, and like you met him last week or something like that. Like, what is it specifically about his like testing style that you like the most, or his methodology?
I think that so it wasn't necessarily his testing style that got me. I think he's like a really good resource in the front end space. He's working on this new project called Remix that's like essentially going to take writing applications to the next level. If you haven't heard about it, I would look it up. I just listened to his full talk on Remix. But he has very like good intentions when it comes to front end technology, and wants to push it to a place that's like more efficient and easy to use. And he advocates for things that are easy to use. And they go back to like a lot of the rudimentary things in JavaScript. A lot of the times we get really focused in like the newest framework and like these fancy things that we can do in writing very complicated code. And I find that a lot of the stuff that he advocates for and pushes is very simplistic in nature, but like simplistic in a really good way. Of like you can do this very simply and efficiently and fast, which like helps us write better front end apps.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and thank you for your insight on that. And Remix, that sounds really awesome. I think I will actually go and check it out. All right. Anybody else have stuff to add? I think we saw some chat here. Harold says a lot of buttons only respond when I click on their text. Baldo says that he pulled open the labs. The CA course covers Mongoose, MongoDB, Chai, and for JS. Okay, so you're talking about the course that you're looking into. Perfect. Okay. Yeah, drop a link later if you want. You know, we can share this in the Discord or something. Yeah, and then I guess I don't know, like, do you have anything to like add, Emily, like in closing, like for just the entire, talk that you had today? Is there something you're going to be working on like in the near future that you can keep us interested in, or like you want us to like look at? We like to connect with a lot of engineers in this community and just kind of like keep tabs and find out what everybody's doing, find out what you want to be working on in a couple months, and maybe invite you back to the group again sometime.
Yeah, so I think for me, I took a pretty big, to wrap up testing.
Yeah.
Like you should be testing, figure out what works for you. You don't have to do everything at once. Find out what's going to be most useful to you, your project, your organization, whatever it is. That like, if you figure that out, that's the crux to it. Just figure out when they're applicable, how to use them. And don't really stress about actually writing the test that will come. That's the easy part. And as far as like me, and I recently took like a pretty big career change. So I stopped coding 2 months ago. Which sounds shocking. Went down the management path. And so now I have a team of engineers, and my goal is to unlock their potential, make them more efficient, and help them with their careers. So if anybody's ever looking to like make that change, and like is scared about letting go of development and kind of like switching gears, I'd love to, like happy to chat about that. If you're like looking for a job and you're wondering like what's the next, like what do I need to have to be marketable, I do a lot of hiring, so I can be helpful there as well. So that's kind of where I'm putting my focus, at least for the time being.
Yeah, that's great. That's actually awesome, that you talked about management and like moving into like, the new role of like being more of a mentor. So, I mean, if you get any kind of insight from all that, definitely, love to have your thoughts on all that, especially in the future, for a future talk or whatever. And then, yeah, I appreciate that you are willing to, talk to us in general about like, interviewing better and stuff like that. So
Yeah,
great.
Yeah, I hate interviewing, especially especially technical interviews. They're hard. I've got some opinions there, but I'll save it for later.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, interview, like I said, it is interview season. I feel like a lot of people are interviewing these days. I know a lot of people personally who are interviewing. It's just one of those things, I think, as a programmer, you have to just kind of live with. Every year, just like businesses have every quarter 1, quarter 2, quarter 3, quarter 4, and they're looking at their financials. I think it makes sense in this day and age too, for engineers, programmers, web developers, everybody in this field to also be just kind of like checking their own financials, checking where they are. Like the industry has changed a lot in that, you could have worked for a company for years and years and years and like gone up that way and got a raise and promotion and all that. I don't feel like it works that way anymore. I could be wrong, but like I kind of feel like nowadays it's more just kind of like based on profit and, like basically, like I would think that a lot of people who are in like high paying roles or whatever are probably going to need to keep their skills relevant. So just kind of to that point, I feel like interviewing is free. That's one good thing of it. It gives you a chance to see what other people are doing in your industry, maybe learn about some technologies and figure out like, what do you know, what do you not know? So I actually advocate for like doing that, even if you don't plan on leaving your company. It's just good in general to just keep tabs on what things you should know and how you can improve yourself. And if you make a goal to get to another level, like maybe LDE2 or L3 or whatever, it's a good goal in general, because every day you have things you can push towards to learn, and you'll feel good about yourself, I guess, maybe after you went through all that hard work, when you like get that next increase or whatever. So
Yeah, fully agree there. So I was at my last company for 6 years, which is like kind of unheard of right now, especially since it was a startup. But I interviewed every 6 months, and you stay relevant. You figure out what people are looking for, and then you try to advocate for projects within your company to do that type of stuff to stay relevant. It's also a really good way to push your income up if you still want to stay at the same company. So if you let them know that you're worth something on the market, it's a lot easier to ask for a raise and provide them with a counter offer. And if they think that you're worth it, they'll want to keep you. If not, you got a better job anyways. So highly recommend to do that, even if you do enjoy the company that you're at.
yeah, exactly. Anybody here want to disagree with this, or got other things to add? Or this is the last question of the night here. Do you have fun? See Jas. Did you guys enjoy the troll?
Hey Vijay, this is Jasper. I joined
Hello.
late, so I didn't get to hear the first part, but I'll definitely listen to the recording. So I'm actually, I've been in testing for 20 plus years, both manual and automation in the last 10 years, and performance testing, right? So I recently read an article that talked about not doing automation testing because it's so not labor intensive, but the maintenance on it is so much, right? And that the people are starting to advocate, don't do any type of large automation, focus on an end-to-end test that tells you something's still going okay or not, right? Any thoughts on that, Emily? Have you heard that line of thinking where people are saying, don't do unit testing, don't do large extensive integration testing, just focus on automation of an integration of an end-to-end test?
Yeah, I think you'll enjoy the talk because I fully agree. So for me, like, there's two things that are integral: unit testing your utility functions, and end-to-end testing your critical paths. And everything in between is completely circumstantial and not necessary in most cases. I think like those reusable functions are super important to make sure that they have the intended output, and then you make sure that you like rendered an actual application when you deploy it, and you make sure that it's working every hour. I fully agree that maintaining a test over time sucks, especially component test. For me, are like the worst to maintain because you really don't want to break your test every time you change your button color, right? Like, kind of sucks.
Right.
And so that's obviously a very rudimentary argument there, but I think it applies. You want your tests to be as maintainable as possible because you don't want to write tests just to delete them or comment them out, is essentially my advice.
Yep. Thanks, Emily.
All right. Excellent. Well, that I think we can wrap up right now and basically, call it a night. I'd love to extend this talk though. I mean, like if people really enjoyed, this meetup tonight and they want to see more of these topics or they want to hear more from Emily, I'd definitely like to know. You can also leave comments on YouTube or in Discord. All right. Thank you, Emily, for your great talk. And we'll see you next time. We'll see you around. Feel free to hit me up anytime on Discord or LinkedIn.
Thank you guys so much for having me. Appreciate it.
All right. Thanks a lot. Bye.